enjoyed Dr. Vine? Hope so. Hope so. We're happy to have him here this afternoon. How many of you are happy that he can now say Wichita instead of Wichita? Many times I call the East Coast in my job, and they say, now, is that in Wichita, Kansas? Okay. As far as you know, yes. Anyway, Dr. Vine, we are so happy to have you here. As I understand this afternoon, subject matter will be religious liberty or liberty. Maybe with a little religious liberty thrown in. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We'll take a love offering at the end back by the door. So we appreciate your help on that.
Testing. All right. So you can all hear me. All right, that's good news. So I've just said about I'm partially deaf in my left ear, and so when I'm lying in bed on my right side, which is always sleep on my right, my wife is talking to me. All I hear is wah, wah, wah in the background. And so I can legitimately say in the morning, I never heard you. And she can legitimately say, but I told you so. And we're both right. And so it's a wonderful way to communicate in marriage, to be partially deaf. So, welcome back this afternoon. It's 2:38. We'll try and be finished here by 4 o'clock. I want to talk with you this afternoon about some mega trends that are happening in our world today. Yesterday I spoke about, last night, about the sexual revolution, various aspects, where it's come from and where it's going. And you can get those hard copies, soft copies from the desk upstairs. But today I want to look at 3 trends that are happening around us in front of our faces. There's a lot of change happening in our world. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of that change may appear random at our level, but a lot of it is not random. And there are people planning these things around us, and we're going to see how that's happening. So we'll open with a word of prayer, and then we will get underway. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the privilege of sharing this afternoon. I pray your blessing upon us now as we talk about these trends that are taking place in America and around the world, trends that will affect us and our children and our children's children and our loved ones and our businesses and everything that we hold dear, Father. And so I ask, Lord, for the gift of your Spirit to guide our hearts, to enrich us and enlighten us. I pray, Lord, that my words will be true and they will be truthful. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, so the next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is megatrend number 1. There are 3 megatrends I want to talk about. And the first of these is what is known as the Great Reset. Have you heard about the Great Reset? So, where does it come from? So, it's important that we read what people actually say. It's important to go to the source document. So, this is a book called COVID-19 and the Great Reset, written by Klaus Schwab. And you can get it on Amazon for about $15. Klaus Schwab is the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. And they meet in Davos in Switzerland every year. And to those meetings come the world's educational and political elites. And Schwab is kind of a visionary for a new form of governance for the world. He believes that the COVID pandemic revealed fundamental flaws in governance systems worldwide, political systems and healthcare systems, and also it underlined profound social divisions and weaknesses in Western society and societies around the world. And so Charles Schwab, have you ever seen him speak, anybody? He's like a baddie out of a James Bond movie. He's the way he speaks with a German accent, with a bald head. There's almost no emotion. When he jokes, it's no laughing matter. So, no, that's a joke, by the way. When he speaks, the world's leaders listen. Now, he's not elected to this position. He was the founder of the World Economic Forum. It's not executive; it's economic there. But he was the founder, but if you look at the who's who of goes to the World Economic Forum meetings every year, they are the top industrialists in the world, the top politicians around the world, religious leaders from the world go there. This is a who's who of the most influential people on planet Earth. And what they're discussing there is not in your best interests, it's in their best interests. It's the interests of how do we perpetuate the social and economic dominance of the elites in our societies, at the expense of the rights of individual citizens. So he wrote this book called The COVID-19 and the Great Reset. I read it on a plane recently, and it's kind of interesting. They're not explicit about what they're calling for, at least in the books, but he wrote this book allegedly to address the weaknesses of capitalism that were allegedly exposed during the COVID pandemic, and more importantly, to reimagine our world. And when he talks about reimagining our world, what Schwab is talking about is the governance systems of our world. Not just how you and I live our lives, but at a broad level, how should governance work at a global level when you have global problems? And so for people like Klaus Schwab, talking about a climate emergency is a great way to talk about world governments working in harmony with one another. Let's put it that way. If not a one world government, then certainly they're talking about the governments of the world coordinating their responses. Now, the term Great Reset that you hear an awful lot about these days was actually coined by a scholar, Dr. Richard Florida, who wrote just after the 2008 global financial crisis that hit us hard here in America with a housing crash. And the subprime mortgages, people giving mortgages who were not creditworthy, then those mortgage assets, the repayment plans were sold all around the world, repackaged, and it was basically worthless assets. And so there was a global financial crisis in 2008. And so Dr. Richard Florida was the first to term the phrase the Great Reset in 2008. Next slide. So in 2018, the World Economic Forum conducted, they collaborated with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security to conduct a simulation of a national pandemic response in America to a novel strain of a human para-influenza virus. It was called CLADEX. It's well documented. Johns Hopkins announced it on their website. It was a well-recognized simulation exercise that looked suspiciously like the COVID-19 exercise. And in October 2019, about 6 months before COVID hit the World Economic Forum collaborated with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Johns Hopkins Center again in what they called Event 201. And this time they were simulating a global response to a global pandemic, again with a para-influenza virus. And I'm not suggesting the pandemic was planned. Okay, let me just be clear about that. I'm just saying that the World Economic Forum was modeling in a simulation exercise, how would the world best respond to an influenza or a pandemic such as COVID, as and when COVID were to hit. So I want to make sure I'm not saying it was planned, but you can draw your own conclusions. Now, CLADEX in Event 201 anticipated pretty much every feature of the COVID crisis, including how governments would respond, how health agencies worldwide, such as the WHO and the CDC and the NIH, etc., how they would respond, how mass media would respond, how our big tech overlords would respond on social media, how the public would respond. Some parts of the world, they imagine there'll be lockdowns, others there'll be riots, there'll be social breakdown, there'll be massive bankruptcy of small mom and pop businesses, the advent of biometric surveillance technology on a global level, social media censorship, crackdown on misinformation, and boosting what they called authoritative sources in the media. That's what they were modeling in 2018, 2019, before the pandemic hit. And this was the World Economic Forum doing this with Johns Hopkins and then Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what we find when we look back on this with hindsight is that many of the features of what happened during the COVID pandemic had already been game planned out in these scenario planning exercises. And so World Economic Forum, because it draws people in from all around the world, business and industrial leaders and health leaders and political leaders, they were able to pretty accurately foretell or in their scenario planning what was going to happen should there be a pandemic at some point of time in the future. Now, next slide, please. Okay, next slide then. All right, so the Great Reset. Now, Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malloret, those are the authors of this book, they're pushing what we now call the Great Reset. And again, the Great Reset is not in your personal interests. It seeks to move us from shareholder capitalism to what they call stakeholder capitalism. Now, shareholder capitalism is where, we saw this with Twitter recently, where the board of directors has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of their shareholders. And that's how, one of the ways that Elon Musk gained control of Twitter, because he could say to the board of Twitter, you're not acting in the financial interests of your shareholders if you don't put my offer to them to the vote. And so he basically forced his way into ownership of Twitter. Now, we're all used to shareholder capitalism, but the World Economic Forum is using the phrase stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism means that the managers of the corporation don't just manage in the interests of their shareholders, those who invested money in the corporation, but they have to manage in favor of all social stakeholders. And so that means to comply with this, the World Economic Forum has rolled out what they call the Environmental, Social and Governance Index. This is known as the ESG Index. This is becoming very, very popular among large corporations. This is a de facto social credit system for corporations. Now, ESG means that these corporations, let's call them woke corporations now, because that is what this is, they are pushing certain expenditures and certain priorities that are not necessarily in the interests of their shareholders, but they're in the interests of wider social stakeholders. So if you invest in a company, your hard-earned savings, the managers are no longer going to manage the company to maximize your dividends or your return on your investment. The ESG index is a system for basically saying which companies have got, let's say, most highly favored status within any government, in any national economy. So the ESG Index, which is, you can Google it, it's out there, it's easily available to see, it leads to what they call favored and unfavored corporations. And as we saw during COVID, we've had a massive movement during COVID. We've hollowed out millions and millions of small, medium-sized enterprises around the world will never reopen after COVID. So what you now have is you have people at the very bottom of the social pile, and you have a few favored but very dominant global corporations at the top. And whether it's information, such as Google, whether it's social media, such as Facebook, whether it's IT, such as Apple or IBM, we now have, and whether it's finances like BlackRock Investing or BlackRock, we now have the COVID has accelerated this trend. So instead of having a pyramid of corporations with a few at the top and many at the bottom, now you have a few at the top and almost nobody in the middle, and lots of people kind of scrabbling around for the scraps at the bottom. And so with these favored corporations using the Environmental, Social and Governance Index, that means that they are becoming more politically active. Disney is a classic example of that, pushing the sexual revolution from the Disney board, and that was kind of leaked to the press, and then Florida has pushed back very dramatically on Disney, if you follow the news. But Disney was basically talking about how to indoctrinate your children in the new sexual morality. That's what they were talking about. That's part of their shareholder capitalism, that they weren't just managing in the interests of Disney stakeholders, shareholders, but they were actually going to manage so that your children are indoctrinated. They were one of these companies pushing for the environmental, that would be the social index that they're pushing there, and governance. And so with the Great Reset, and next slide please, we now have the introduction of the concept of fairness. And fairness to the World Economic Forum means essentially lowering the economic status of citizens in developed countries like the US or Britain or Japan or Germany in favor of citizens in lesser developed nations. And so the idea is we're a global community, and it's not right that the G7 are the G7 or the G20 or the G20 and everybody else is also ran economically. We need to tip the scales in favor of the lesser developed nations and away from being in favor of the more highly developed nations. And so the net result of this is that SMEs, that's small and medium-sized enterprises and businesses, are being squeezed or eliminated across the West as a result of COVID. So next slide, please. So within the Great Reset, corporations now act as agents of the state. It's a really important point to understand. The state, the reach of the state is now greatly empowered by corporations leveraging their assets to implement government policy. Now, a great example of this was when the US Supreme Court overturned the vaccine mandates in January this year. Remember that? How did our president respond? He gave he spoke to the press, and he said to the corporations, we'll do it anyway. Do you remember that? Okay, so what this means is the corporations are now arms of the state, but you have no democratic control over those corporations. You can't change the ownership of Ford or the ownership of Disney or the ownership of Coca-Cola, but depending on who you vote for, independent, Democrat or Republican in your local elections. These corporations are beyond your control, but they're acting as the agents and the instruments of the state. And so this is part of the Great Reset, where you are moving the government policy away from democratic control, and now the corporate sector is now an enforcement arm of whatever policies the government wants to implement. And so corporations in America and around the world do not answer to voters at a local or a national level. And with multinational corporations these days that kind of work their way around the globe, the state, let's say the United States or the British state or the German state, becomes a globalist entity where British companies are enforcing the will of the British government, and there's no democratic control over this. So you end up with a de facto one world, like government of states collaborating together, and multinationals cooperating together to impose their own agenda. And so democracies, such as America or Australia or Korea or Britain or Germany or Finland, are transformed into compliant populations where you have globalist totalitarian corporations run by technocrats and bilateral agencies. This is where we now have to trust the experts, and government is by technocrats rather than by democratically elected rulers. And so this is what part of the Great Reset is talking about. Now, this is the classic definition of fascism. When you talk about fascism, we always think of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini in Italy, but the definition of fascism is that there is nothing outside of the state and nothing opposed to the state, that the state is everything. So the corporations act as arms of the state. And so what we're looking at now is a classic definition in the Great Reset of fascism, where I'm not talking about Nazis on the streets, I'm talking about where Coca-Cola and Ford and IBM and General Motors and every big employer in America is being encouraged by the administration to act as the enforcement arm of government policy, even if the Supreme Court has overturned those policies as being unconstitutional. So you can sue the government not to impose mandates, but you can't sue Coca-Cola not to impose a mandate. That's just their terms of employment. If you don't like it, you've got to leave. And so this is what part of the Great Reset involves. And so your opportunity to speak up or to speak against some changes or to make meaningful change at the ballot box is being systematically eroded by the Great Reset. The next slide, please. Some other features of the Great Reset include unrestricted migration around the world. There was a meeting in Morocco a couple of years ago, and over 100 countries signed up to what they call the right to migrate. That is, that's a globalist agreement that essentially says people have the right to move around the world, regardless of what the receiving countries may think about it. And so your national sovereignty, the ability to control your own borders, is being fatally undermined by the right to migrate. The unrestrained monetary expansion of fiat currencies. Well, that's kind of an economic term. What does it mean? Well, the dollar is a fiat currency. Fiat is Latin. It's a use of subjunctive. It means let it be, like let there be light. And so we used to have the dollar was tied to the price of gold, yes? And the amount of dollars in circulation was tied to how much gold was in Fort Knox. Now the British were on the gold standard up until the early 1920s, and we abandoned it because we couldn't keep up with it anymore. And Nixon took America off the gold standard back in the 70s. And that allowed governments, Republican or Democrat, it matters not, to basically spend without any control. And everybody pays nominal, allegiance to the need for a balanced budget, but nobody does it in practice. It doesn't matter who you are, nobody's doing it. And so when you inflate your fiat currency, when the currency is not tied to anything real, you can print as much of it as you want. And that's what's been happening across the West. And during the COVID crisis, there's been massive government printing all across the West that's leading to the devaluation of our currencies. And if you don't think your currency is being devalued, just look at how much you're paying for your groceries. I was chatting with someone the other day who said, I used to be able to buy a pound of beans for $1 a year ago. Now it's $2 for the same bag of beans. So what inflation does is it steals your time. You can always get more money, but you can't get your time back. So inflation effectively means you have to work longer for the same economic outcomes. So it's stealing your time. And your time is a finite resource. And so it's not just that monies go down in value, your time goes down in value as well. And that means you as a person are worth less to the economic system. So particularly during COVID, governments have been quite happy to radically expand government expenditure, like by the trillions of dollars, because as we're going to see in a minute, most governments realize, and the World Economic Forum also realizes, is that our fiat currencies are basically doomed. But this isn't, last night was pretty depressing, this is pretty depressing as well. If you look at the projections for US federal government spending, and where our federal government's been spending its money, I think it's about the year 2030, if nothing changes, all of the money goes on Social Security, Medicaid and Medicare, and debt repayment. And there's nothing left for anything else. So our government knows, and the World Economic Forum knows, and Britain's in the same position as well, and so is Germany and the other advanced countries, that our current economic system is simply unsustainable. The only question is, how are we going to manage, and when are we going to manage to a new economic system? That's why it's called the Great Reset. And so the value of your dollars, governments can print trillions of dollars, and every time they print trillions of dollars, the value of your dollar goes down. And it goes down and down and down until it's worthless. Then you have to have a new economic system put in place. So that's why other features of the Great Reset include increasing taxation, increased dependence upon the state. We've seen that through COVID crisis, where people are becoming a client electorate. If you are dependent upon the government for benefits, you're less likely to vote them out, or for a change of government. And so reduced individual economic independence is a part of the Great Reset, because now we're looking for environmental, social, and government goals, the Esg Index, where your economic position is less important than that of the wider community. The introduction of personal carbon allowances, that's now being talked about by the World Economic Forum, vaccine mandates, and informal social credit schemes. Now, China has a very advanced social credit scheme. And in China, it works this way. If you don't watch certain propaganda films, and if you don't recite certain slogans on social media, and if you don't have enough likes for what President Xi says, then you're going to be penalized by the Chinese government. And you, for instance, may not be allowed to travel overseas. Your children may not be allowed to go to college. And these are very practical consequences. You may be downgraded in the waiting list for public housing. And so the social credit system is a means by which, if you are a compliant citizen and do as your masters expect of you, then you can survive in society. But if you happen to have a different religious or political or economic view, then you're going to be penalized, and so will your children. And this is known as the social credit scheme in China, and it's up and running, and it's very effective. Now we are facing that increasingly in America, and it's known as cancel culture. You've heard of cancel culture, yes? If you don't say the right things, then you're going to be penalized. If you say the wrong things, a mob will destroy you. Like even this last week, we have police guarding the home of Justice Alito in Washington, D.C., because they know that a literal mob may try and batter him to death because he's authored the decision overturning Roe versus Wade. So the rule of law is replaced by the rule of the mob. We're seeing that in America right now. And we don't have an official social credit scheme, but we do have cancel culture, and it's alive and well. And as I said last night, more and more Americans are self-censoring what they say on social media, because you're afraid that what you say today, if it's considered normal, will be considered hate speech in a year's time, and then you're going to be deplatformed or lose your job or something because of something that you said in the past. And the net result is Americans are becoming very quiet about what they believe because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. So we don't have an official social credit scheme like China has, but in the Great Reset, in the West, we have a form of it, and it's known as cancel culture, and this is very real. And so this is what they're talking about in the Great Reset. Now, the net result of this for religious liberty is chilling. Because, for instance, our understanding of Revelation 13, the role of America and the papacy as the end-time foes of God's people, will be declared hate speech. And those who proclaim it will be cancelled. Physically, financially, socially, off the internet, and so forth and so forth. And then the restrictions will get worse. And so we'll end up with no buy, no sell mandates, and eventually the death penalty for those who disagree with those end-time powers. And so the Great Reset is essentially moving us from being valuable, independent economic units to now we must bow before the gods of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Index, which is pushing a whole version of other policy priorities that really do not coincide with your policy priorities at all. So that's what we have as the first mega trend. It's the Great Reset. And the second mega trend is the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And again, Klaus Schwab has very helpfully written a book on it. It's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And again, it's worth reading it. Because we need to know what these people are saying and what they're publishing out there. It's important for us to spend the time listening to the conferences, reading their books, because then we understand, okay, this is what's happening, this is what they're pushing for. Now, a lot of what they push for is spoken about in very bland terms. But if you want to know how administrators work, and I'm an administrator for many years, if you look at there's there's a movie called Conference. I think it's called Conference. It's about the Wannsee Conference where the final solution was planned out. It's a true story. What happened was in December 1941, I think it was, there was a meeting just outside Berlin, and the head of the SS was there, Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich was there. He was the effective acting head of the SS, and with him was the guy who was executed in Jerusalem, who was the guy who the Israelis captured. And it was the trial of the century in the 60s. I'm trying to remember his name. It wasn't Joseph Mengele, it was Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was there, he was an administrator, and there was the head of the Reichspolice, and there was the Department of Justice, and all the rest of it. And they had a conference, and they discussed the problem of how to free the world of Jewry, of the Jews. And they discussed, well, we can't shoot them all because the effect on our soldiers is emotionally degrading, and we can't make them all sterile. I mean, this is what they were talking about. So in the end, they said, let's just move to the final solution, which is let's just kill them, and but we're not going to call it killing, we're going to call it special treatment. And they're going to be relocated to the east as a bland way of saying taken into the death camps. And so if you watch that movie, and the movie is based on the transcripts, Heydrich tried to destroy all the transcripts of that conference, but somebody kept a transcript. And that's the transcript is the basis for the movie. It's utterly chilling because they're sitting around the table eating their hot drinks and their cakes and Danish pastries, discussing the elimination of the Jews. And what strikes you as horrifying about it is that they don't talk about it in explicit terms. Everything is carefully cloaked in bland administrative language. I think the movie is called Conference. It's worth watching to get an insight into how evil people can be. But so when you read books like this, like by Klaus Schwab, you need to realize that when administrators have malign intent at heart, they'll often cloak it in very bland administrative language. So we are now in the fourth industrial revolution. Let's just look back at history. The first industrial revolution started in England in 1760 to 1840, and the key inventions were the railroads and the steam engines. That led to mechanical production, such as the mills of England. And if you know the song Jerusalem, the second verse talks about those dark and satanic mills, because many of the working class of England recognized that what happened in the mills was really dehumanizing. So you have the first industrial revolution that started in Britain. The second industrial revolution really started in America, and that's from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And the two key factors in the second industrial revolution was electricity and the assembly line. And the assembly line ushered in mass production, and a good example of that is Henry Ford and the Ford production lines. And so that was the second industrial revolution. The third industrial revolution, which is what most of us have lived through, it was from the 1960s to the early 2000s, and that's computers, semiconductors, personal computing, and the internet. That ushered in the digital era. And so we do things today that our parents would never have thought possible, yes? You can go to a phone like this, and you can type in, if you got an app on this, the name of any piece of music that's ever been created, and it will play for you in a second or two. It's astonishing. You have access to almost all the knowledge in human history just in this little device in your pocket. And my grandparents would never have imagined that would ever be possible. My grandfather once gave me the Encyclopedia Britannica about the age of 8, and I had no use for this. So I discovered a use for it. My dad had a pellet gun, and I wanted to see how powerful it was. So I would stack them up on the corridor when my mum and dad went out, and I'd fire from one end of the corridor into this stack of books. What I discovered was that you start off with a neat hole in the front cover of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and then when you get to about 2 inches in, it looks like a thumb's been smashing its way through the paper. And after you've shot like 10 pellets in, you open up the encyclopedia and all this shredded paper drops out. So I thought this was a good use of that source of knowledge. But anyway, the third industrial revolution, we've just lived through the third industrial revolution. We're now moving into the fourth industrial revolution. And what's the characteristic of the fourth industrial revolution? First of all, we have integrated IT systems globally. There's an integration of IT that is astonishing. So when I get off a plane in Denver yesterday, As I land my plane, I switch my phone on, and a text comes through from United saying, your plane has just landed, here's a map to your next gate, it's an 8-minute walk, and your next plane takes off at this time. And when I get on the plane there, and just before the gate is closed, it says, your gate is closing, hurry up, get to this gate. When I get on the plane, and when I land here, a text comes through and says, this is where your baggage is on this gate. I mean, we'd think that is kind of normal these days, but even 10 years ago, that wasn't going to happen. There's an integration of IT systems that is really is profound. From a missionary perspective, one of the biggest threats to missionary work is facial recognition software. Because more and more countries are now reading your faces when you enter their port of entry. And they'll compare you against Google's databases, and even if you're trying not to be known as a missionary, it's a closed access country, they'll see, oh, they took a picture of you in Wichita church at a missionary event, you must be a missionary, and we'll deny you entry. And so the integration of, say, surveillance systems with vast global databases means it's getting harder and harder to travel the world as a missionary. This is a practical example of this. So with the integration of IT systems, we have smart manufacturing and 3D manufacturing. Now 3D manufacturing is pretty remarkable. And it's not just manufacturing goods, but it's also looking at manufacturing organs on a customizable level in the medical sphere. Okay, and so this is issuing in global integration at all levels, whether it be economically, politically, and sociologically. So when China put Shanghai into lockdown, all right, we want to buy, in one of our projects in Southeast Asia, we needed to buy 2 servers. Those servers, before the lockdowns, came from a Shanghai factory, were $8,000 for each server. After the Shanghai lockdowns, they're up to like $14,000 per server, because the servers come from Shanghai. And Shanghai's locked down, no supply chain. And so what we find is that they sneeze in Shanghai, quite literally, and there's an economic, direct economic impact on another part of the world. And so we have this economic digital integration at a worldwide level. So next slide. So some of the key industries. Next slide, brothers. Okay, next. Okay, yeah, we'll leave it there for a minute. So what are the key technologies of the 4th Industrial Revolution? One is autonomous vehicles. That's a big growth area. So at the moment there's a shortage of truck drivers in America, but soon there won't be a need for truck drivers. And vehicles will become autonomous. Not only will they become autonomous, it means that when you get into the vehicle, you no longer have control of that vehicle. So you're probably aware the federal government is pressuring all manufacturers to have a kill switch in every car that's sold from now on. So if the police are chasing you, they can press a button and that car will just stop. That's called the kill switch, and that's now because of these integrated IT systems, the federal government is now requiring it for new vehicles, these kill switches. So I hope you're not running from the police, but if you are, there'll be, and if you need an old vehicle, not a new vehicle. 3D printing. You can print almost anything you want these days with a 3D printer. And if you've got an enterprising teenager in your house, give them a 3D printer for Christmas and see what they start producing. It's amazing what you can produce with a 3D printer, and it just goes back and forth, and it manufactures something for you that otherwise you have to wait 6 or 12 weeks for from a supplier. You can manufacture your own spare parts, or you can manufacture some incredible things with 3D printing. Advanced robotics. And so advanced robotics, this is also connected not just to like robots. Yesterday in the airport I saw an advert for a German robotic vacuum cleaner. And so I looked online at this advert and said, that looks kind of neat. And this was thousands and thousands of dollars. It's for big warehouse systems, not for your average home. And the technology in that robot was astonishing. What it could do, and it would do so many feet per square feet per second, and it was connected to the internet, and it would look at the architectural plans for your building, and it could figure out the most efficient way of doing it, and so forth. So we have advanced robotics on a large scale, but some of the greatest advances in robotics are happening with nanotechnology. And we're going to see that when we come to transhumanism. The merging of technology with humanity is very much on the cards now. It's being actively pursued by people like Elon Musk. So advanced robotics isn't just having a robot walking around cleaning your floor for you at home, but it's actually having robotics that you can inject into somebody's veins, and maybe it'll clean out your veins for you to get rid of the atherosclerosis or get rid of the plaque. We think that's a good thing, but some of the intended uses of transhumanism are really have nothing to do with that. We are looking at new materials such as graphene, which is far stronger than steel and comes in you get strands of it that are a fraction of the size of a hair. PHTs are recyclable thermosetting polymers. Smart materials that if you bend it, it will go back to its original shape. It's not going to stay bent. And so we already use some of these technologies in daily life, but increasingly we're having smart materials that will remember the right shape to be no matter what you may do to it. The interconnection of IT, this is a major factor affecting our world today. Blockchain. Any of you familiar with blockchain? Have you heard of blockchain? It's where cryptocurrencies go. It's a global disseminated ledger where computers all around the world are making transactions amongst each other, and it's not controlled by any central bank. We'll come to that when we talk about cryptocurrencies. Gene editing, you've heard of CRISPR technology, or Cas9, these are methods of gene editing and therapy. This is normally sold to us on the basis that we can eliminate a gene that may lead to a certain disease. We can actually edit your genes for you in utero. And that gene editing software, CRISPR, is at least 10 years old now. It's quite well established technology. And so some people may use it, for instance, having designer babies. But you may also use it for more nefarious purposes. And so once you have that kind of technology, the lesson of the late 1800s was that technology in the hands of humans doesn't necessarily lead to great progress. So did any of you watch the Anne of Green Gables series? Yeah, on the Avonlea series? Yeah, with, I forget the names of those characters. My daughter liked them, but I used to do penance as a father by watching Avonlea with my daughter. Well, you notice in those movies that it's very well done because it portrays the modernist worldview very well. You have a young boy, and Cedric, I think his name, there's a young boy who's always playing with the latest technologies. There's a crazy inventor in the series, I forget his name, who's always playing with the latest technology and saying, look at this is like a gramophone, or this is a telephone, or this is a voice recorder. And the village is abuzz with how this latest technology is going to transform our world. And the series comes to an end in 1914. All right? And so the modernist era assumed that all this technological progress will lead to human good. What it actually did was it meant we could kill each other more efficiently from 1914 to 1918. And that was the start of postmodernism, disillusionment with the modernist worldview. Well, today we have gene editing software and therapy that can be used for good, but it can also be used for evil in the wrong hands. And we also have the rise of artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence or machine learning, this is, Google or Facebook, they have their algorithms, they know what you like, they know what you watch. So they can put adverts in front of you that they know you're likely to look at, because they have machine learning, and so the machine actually learns about you, and it can project what you're going to be interested in. And so your news feed starts to reflect what you're interested in. It's not the actual news, but it's what the machine thinks you're interested in. And so with artificial intelligence, we're seeing the rise of artificial intelligence now that's actually very intelligent and can actually start to think for itself. And so the net result of this is you get to transhumanism. We'll come to that well, this is it here now. Transhumanism. So here's a book called Humans 2.0. And transhumanism is a real thing. This was published last year. This is a discussion of the philosophical and ethical concerns of transhumanism. Now, what is transhumanism? Well, you see it on the slide there. This is from a transhumanist website. Transhumanism is a class of philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and human limitations by means of science and technology, guided by life-promoting principles and values. Now, so transhumanism is used in some extent, let's say in China. They're trying to edit the genes of their soldiers so they no longer feel pain, which is handy if you're in the military. So they're using gene editing across there in China, but transhumanism is much more than that. Next slide, please. So what transhumanists believe is that we as a species are at a relatively early stage of evolutionary development, and we have great potential for future evolution. And the best way to do this is by combining your biology with artificial intelligence. Now, the reason we want to do this, apparently, is because if we don't merge with artificial intelligence will become more intelligent than we are and take over the planet. A bit like the Planet of the Apes, you know, that kind of idea. But this isn't like the apes become more intelligent than the humans, it's that computers become more intelligent than human beings. And so the best way to recognize the threat that artificial intelligence represents to the human species is to actually merge human biology with artificial intelligence. And this is why we're talking about humans 2.0. So this isn't science fiction, this is actually happening right now. And this is what people like Elon Musk, you all heard of Elon Musk? His big dream is transhumanism. It's not Twitter and it's not going to Mars. His biggest dream is transhumanism. He's a major proponent of the transhumanism movement. And so what we're doing is we're merging the biology of who I am with artificial intelligence or robotic technology. So as an example of this, there's a publicly listed company, next slide please, called Neuralink. And Neuralink was established by Elon Musk in 2016. It's based in San Francisco. They're developing implantable brain-human interfaces. Now, what does that mean? Well, literally, apparently they've been experimenting on rats and monkeys so far. They're starting to plan the human experiments later this year. And what this is seeking to do is they put a neural web into your brain, which is literally, it's like a fisherman's net, but it goes around your brain, and it has thousands of small wires, some made of graphene, some made of other technologies, that are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the size of human hair, and it will connect to each of the synapses of your brain. This is what they're working on with rats and monkeys, and the plan is to do it to humans. They call it, I forget what they call it, the brain-human interface. They call it the neural cap or something. Now, what are they trying to do? Because every thought is ultimately an electronic impulse that goes from one part of the brain to another. And what they're trying to do is to read those electronic impulses. Then they connect those electronic impulses to the web. So what Elon Musk is arguing, what he wants to do is he wants to solve disabilities. So that if somebody is paralyzed in their right arm, for instance, and the brain, they can think something, but nothing works in the arm, you can actually take the arm off and put a robotic arm on, and then when you think something in your brain, the neural cap in your brain will send a message to the internet which will instruct your robotic arm to do what you want it to do. So you are now basically like a droid connected to the internet servers, and as you think, so your exoskeleton moves. Okay, so this is, you can actually buy shares in Neuralink. You know, they're a listed company. This is not conspiracy theory or science fiction. This is happening right now. The attempt to evolve humanity. Now, it's not just that you solve serious brain diseases, like help people overcome the effects of a stroke, or overcome blindness or deafness or physical disability, because that's what Elon Musk is talking about as the initial goal of transhumanism. The eventual goal of transhumanism is to achieve human immortality. And why is that possible? Because if your memories are basically electronic pulses in your brain, then the neural cap can read your memories and store it in a database. And if your body dies, you, as a person, reside within a database. And then those memories, if they can be taken out of the brain, can be put into the brain of a young person, you have a new life again, you see. So it's kind of like, it's not brain surgery or brain transplants, it's reading the mind so that we can extract your memories and your personality from your brain, from your mind, and then we can re-engineer it so it goes back into a fresh brain somewhere. And so you would effectively live forever, just in different bodies. So this is what, where kind of humans 2.0 is going, is the upgrade of the human species, so that we are basically an interface. My body is simply the today's host for an interface between mind, memory, and technology. And so this is actually raising profound questions. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is actually raising profound questions about what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. So experimentation has been going on with rats and monkeys. Many of the rats and monkeys had to be put down, according to Musk's company, Neuralinks, where human experimentation is due to begin later this year. And the ostensible purpose is to help people. They'll connect them to the internet so that the cap reads your thoughts, and then the computers instruct your external exoskeleton, your prostheses to do the tasks that you want it to do. So you overcome your disabilities that way. So under transhumanism, you'll be connected to the internet via your brain, so your memories, knowledge, and thoughts can be downloaded to a server. And when you combine that with the capacity for gene editing, such as CRISPR software, transhumanism presents a profound question about what it means to be a human. This is the biggest change in humanity ever since the fall, probably. And nobody really knows where it's going to go, except we're all humans 1.0. And one day walking in our midst will be humans 2.0. Then there'll be humans 3.0. And there'll be substantive differences, almost like different species. And what you're going to be almost certain of is that the latest version will seek to rule over the lower versions. So this is what's happening with the fourth industrial revolution. Next slide, please. So simultaneous breakthroughs that we're seeing in the world today in gene sequencing, in nanotechnology, that's technology at a microscopic level, and in quantum computing, they're all affecting us socially, biologically, and politically. Now, what Schwab said in 2016, and this is where you've got to read between the lines, but this is a quote from Schwab in 2016. He said, "I feel that the required levels of leadership and understanding of the changes underway across all sectors are low when contrasted with the need to rethink our economic, social, and political systems to respond to the fourth industrial revolution. As a result, both at the national and global levels, the requisite institutional framework to govern the diffusion of innovation and mitigate the disruption is inadequate at best, and at worst, absent altogether." Do you read what he's actually saying there? That the current governance systems of our world are woefully inadequate to respond to what's happening to humanity. And so all of our political systems may have been designed in the 18th and 19th century for humanity 2.0, but with the fourth industrial revolution, with the greater interconnectedness of technologies and gene sequencing and gene editing and nanotechnologies, what he's saying is that all of our systems of leadership are basically inadequate, and so we need to rethink a new system of world governance in order to respond to these technological challenges. So he's not calling for the papacy in America to dominate the world. What he is saying is that the governance systems we have today, including representative democracy, are basically inadequate to respond to the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. That we need to rethink how we govern ourselves. And normally when somebody calls for that, they're not calling for greater participation on your part or my part. This is calling for greater centralization of decision making. So the fourth industrial revolution, next slide please, which is out there. You can read about it on the internet. There are books about it. The World Economic Forum is openly talking about these things. It parallels the Great Reset in requiring or pushing humanity towards a global governance system. That's the net result of this, where this is going. So then we come to digital currencies. Now, the third of our mega trends. I'll put these books away for now. So the digital currencies, you've all heard of Bitcoin, yes? And so digital currencies, we said before that all the economies in the world today currently use fiat currencies, which are basically printed at the touch of a button. They're not based on anything substantive other than something as solid as confidence, which is in short supply. And supply of our fiat currencies is controlled via monetary and fiscal policy at a national level. And as we see in America, the supply of money is really driven by whoever is on top of the political pile, whatever their domestic priorities are. And Nobody really cares about who's going to pay the bills. Now, our fiat currencies, such as the US dollar, are rapidly devaluing due to inflation. Due to the expansionary monetary printing we've seen since 2008 and exacerbated by COVID, and by economic adjustments such as competitive devaluations that some countries implement in order to improve their competitiveness vis-a-vis each other. So not only are we in a race to the bottom, but some people want to get to the bottom quicker than everybody else, so their exports become temporarily cheaper. So we are seeing the death of fiat currency. So you might say it's only a matter of time before the US dollar is dead, it's worthless. It'll be like the Zimbabwe dollar, pound became worthless, be like the German mark under the Weimar Republic, where you could take your pay home in a wheelbarrow, and you couldn't buy a loaf of bread with it, and that led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. Russia had the same problem, the collapse of their currency before the Bolshevik Revolution. And generally when you have economic collapse, it paves the way for a political revolution that generally brings a strong man in control with a particular ideology because he promises to restore order. So inflation, and next slide please. All right, yeah, so inflation destroys the middle class. That's the number one thing that inflation does, because it concentrates economic power in the hands of the social, economic, and political elites in a given nation. It also erodes the value of the national debt. This is the advantage from the government's perspective. It erodes the value of the national debt, because if you have debt and there's inflation, the real value of that debt is dropping day by day. So if you have a mortgage today for $100,000, and there's 10% annual inflation, in 1 year's time, if you don't pay any money into that mortgage, the real value of that mortgage is actually $90,000. Okay, so if you have debt in times of inflation, it's not really worth your while paying it off, because inflation will erode the real value for you. If you have savings and there's inflation, guess what happens to your savings? It erodes as well. So what happens is that when you have inflation, that which is economically virtuous, which is not to have debt and to have savings, is entirely reversed. It then makes sense to take out as much debt as you can and not to have savings, because inflation is going to wipe out the real value of that debt. So the economic virtues get turned upside down, and inflation acts as a regressive tax on the poor. The poor are very hard hit by inflation. The reason for that is the poor spend a huge proportion of their income on food and rent and utilities. Whereas Bill Gates only spends a fraction of his income on rent and food and utilities. Whereas if you're living on, I don't know, $1,000 a month, and food prices going up and rent's going up and utilities are going up, you're going to be hit hard. And so the poor are really affected really terribly by inflation. And so inflation means it's logical to spend today rather than to save, and that's actually, so if we all act rationally and logically, when we see inflation, when we get paid, we immediately spend it, which is the rational thing to do as an individual. At a national level, that actually exacerbates the inflationary pressures. It makes the situation worse. So you're in an economic death spiral. And so the bottom line is that our fiat currencies are unsustainable as they currently are set up. And so next slide, please. Now, this partly explains the rise of cryptos. Now, there's a difference between centralized finance and decentralized finance. Now, with centralized finance, this is why cryptos came into existence. If I want to send money to a missionary in Albania, I have to issue a wire instruction to my bank in Berrien Springs, who issues a wire instruction to a corresponding bank in New York, who issues a corresponding instruction to a corresponding bank in London, who issues a wire transfer note to a bank in, let's say, Albania, and then the missionary may get the money, if he's lucky. And the only way, this is called centralized financing, because you only can bank with the permission of the bankers. And if they don't like you, then you're not going to get a bank account, and they're not going to make your wire transfers for you, etc., etc. And that's called centralized finance, and that gives the government oversight and control of what you do with your money. Now, in response to that, cryptos, as we currently have them, are known as decentralized finance, which is allowing for peer-to-peer transactions. So I can give money to Brother Brandt here directly in crypto without the need to go through a bank. And there's no government oversight over that. That's why cryptos are so attractive to people, because if politicians are controlling the fiat currencies, And the politicians are messing up the fiat currencies, which they are, regardless of what party they are, they're messing up. So people around the world are switching to decentralized finance rather than centralized finance, and that means you can do financial transactions without the need for a central bank clearance system. Does that make sense? Like, I got a check the other day, it's about $5,000. It was a nice check. And I put it in the bank, and the bank says, you can have 1,000 today, and you can have your other 5,000 on Friday. And I said, why? Well, you know, we need to check on terrorism and stuff like that, and we'll hold it. What they're actually doing is they will clear it that day and then invest it for 3 days in the money markets, make a profit on it, and give it to you on Friday. All right? They're making money on these things, but with decentralized finance, my son has crypto, and I got a few hundred or so in crypto, and so I say to my son, okay, you need to pay me for something. He hates it when I say that to him. David, you owe me money for this, this, and this. And he says, okay, Dad, and I get a beep on my phone, and the cryptos just come into my account. From phone to phone, just like that. There's no need to go through a bank. The government has no control over it. And with these cryptos, there are many different kinds of cryptos. I've given you a few on the screen there. But, okay, next slide, please. The cryptos allow for greater personal control of your finance. It avoids currency controls, and it can be used globally. Now, currency controls are a big deal because that's how governments prop up the value of their currencies. So, for instance, this is a hypothetical example, okay? And this is hypothetical, okay? If you live in Brazil, you cannot transfer out more than $10,000 worth of Brazilian reais to America without the approval of the central bank. And they don't give that permission easily. So how do you get money out of Brazil? Well, with your Brazilian account, you buy $20,000 worth of Bitcoin. And then a touch of a button, you transfer that from your wallet in Sao Paulo to my wallet in New York. And that comes into my wallet, and I can either keep it in my crypto wallet or I can sell it for dollars in America. And I avoid entirely the capital controls that the government's put in place. So governments don't like cryptos because it's a means by which you can circumvent capital controls, and the government doesn't like that. And so places like Ghana and Nigeria are accepting cryptos, so when people work in Britain and they send their remittances home to their family back home, you might say in Nigeria, they're sending it in Bitcoin, because this avoids all government control. So these cryptos are very helpful for people who want to get around the control systems that the world financial systems have in place. I'm not saying they're entirely a good thing, okay? I'm not recommending them to you, say, but you should at least be aware of these things. Now, some cryptos are inherently deflationary. So Bitcoin is based on a mathematical formula, and the maximum possible numbers of Bitcoin that can come into existence is 21 million. It's a mathematical formula. And currently there are about 18.9 million Bitcoins in existence. And a Bitcoin is code on the blockchain. It's not actually a coin. And so what that means is that within another year or so, there'll be no more Bitcoin, no more supply of Bitcoin. So just imagine if the supply of dollars were just to stop. That means the value of dollar would skyrocket. No more supply. If the supply is infinitely inelastic, doesn't respond to price changes, you're likely to see the prices to surge globally with something where there's no further supply in the world. And so some people are looking at cryptos as a way of avoiding government control, a way of beating inflation, a way of transferring monetary value around the world without government control, as a way of sending remittances back to their countries. And you can actually, you get through practices such as staking, you can actually earn a very high return on your cryptocurrencies. You can earn 40, 50% on an annual basis through, you buy some crypto, then you lend it to somebody else on these exchanges, and then they'll give you the returns. You can get extremely high yields on crypto through practices such as staking. So next slide, please. Talking more about cryptos. Now, crypto assets, must be stored in a hot or a cold wallet. And a crypto wallet is basically a string of numbers and letters known as your private key. And private keys are used to unlock the user's addresses. Now, for a crypto transaction to occur, two parties need to share their addresses, and the blockchain then needs to verify them to make sure that each party has the necessary funds. And the blockchain takes place on servers all around the world, and it's designed that way so that no one government can control it. Now, the Chinese government bans Bitcoin, and the next week, all the Bitcoin mining activity transfers to Texas, for instance. Now, Texas is a global center of Bitcoin mining, for instance. And so if Texas were to crack down on Bitcoin, the Bitcoin mining process would shift to El Salvador. I mean, these things just happen almost overnight. And so the horse has bolted when it comes to cryptos. It's very hard for governments to control it. Now, you can have a hot wallet or a cold wallet. A hot storage is where you store in an online exchange, such as Kraken or Coinbase. And cold storage is on an external thumb drive. You actually carry your crypto on a thumb drive, and you can carry it from country to country. Now, think about the advantage of that. How much money can you take out of America in your pocket when you fly out of Atlanta? $10,000. You have to declare anything beyond $10,000. But cryptocurrency has been classified by the Treasury as an asset, not as a currency. So you can have $1 billion in crypto on your thumb drive and just fly to Europe and sell it in Europe, because it's not viewed as currency by the Department of Treasury. It's an asset. It's like taking a car across the Atlantic. So they don't view it as money. So you can actually transfer huge amounts of economic value around the world on a thumb drive with these cold storage systems. So next slide, please. So why am I talking about this? Well, our Western governments are anticipating the death of our fiat currencies. It's why our Western governments are happy to print the dollar or the pound sterling into oblivion, because they know it's going to die. Let's squeeze as much juice out of it as we can, let's put it that way. And so our Western governments are actively developing digital currencies of their own, such as in Britain it's going to be called Bitcoin, and the Bank of England is already working on that, and in America it's going to be the digital dollar. Now, there's a difference. These are not cryptocurrencies, they're digital currencies. And a central bank can issue what is known as a retail CBDC, as a central bank digital currency, or they can issue a central bank-backed digital currency known as a synthetic CBDC. Those are the two classifications out there. And as with cryptos, your transactions will be recorded as a transfer of tokens between digital wallets on the blockchain. Now, President Biden gave an instruction to the Department of Treasury about 3 months ago to start the development of a US digital dollar. You may have seen that in the news, may not have made it in your news feed, but that's what he did. And so the US government knows that the dollars in your pocket are basically doomed. They're already starting the switch to a digital dollar where you will live and buy and sell in a digital world rather than a physical world. The Chinese central bank has already switched to a digital yuan. They've been experimenting that for a couple of years. The British are moving towards it. The European Union is thinking of it for the euros. But more and more countries around the world are realizing that fiat currencies are going to die, and we need to switch over. And so in the new system, central banks would effectively be the competitors of, regulators for, and the final guarantee for commercial banks, which means the rational economic consumer would shift all their deposits away from their current bank to the central bank in their country. Okay? That's the rational economic thing to do, which means that more and more people in countries that have digital central currencies would bank with the central government bank. Our next slide, which means that central bank digital currency, CBDCs, will centralize economic power with national governments in an unprecedented way. Now, Tom Mutton, he's the Director of Financial Technology at the Bank of England, he described it this way, and he said this just a few months ago. He talked about introducing Britcoin, the British digital currency. He said there could be some socially beneficial outcomes for that, such as preventing activity which is seen to be socially harmful in some way. You see what he's saying? That the government will decide what is socially beneficial activity and socially harmful activity, and because they control the digital currency, they can stop you spending money on what they consider to be socially harmful. This means that the government will be second-guessing every transaction you ever make. That's the net effect of what we're talking about here. So when you have dollars now, and you go to someone and say, I'll give you $50 for something, the government's not looking over your shoulder. They have no idea you're making that transaction. It's a private transaction. But with central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, the Bank of England is explicitly talking about it. We want to prevent activity which is seen to be socially harmful in some way. And so the US federal government is also seeking greater oversight over cryptos and actually over all your personal transactions. Just a few months ago, the Biden administration wanted your bank to report every transaction over $600. $600, every transaction the government needs to have a look at, which these days is a lot of your transactions. And you must ask yourself, why does the government need to know what you spend your money on? Well, it's for purposes of social and political control. So when you move towards central bank digital currencies, these are separate to cryptocurrencies, because cryptos are designed to avoid this kind of stuff. You see that governments are competing with cryptocurrencies by introducing their own digital currencies, and they're also looking to have greater oversight over the cryptocurrencies out there. So next slide. So what we're going to see is that central banks will inevitably become instruments of government policy, otherwise known as government coercion, approving loans and expenditures for socially desirable or politically approved transactions, and also freezing the accounts of those who hold unacceptable views in any given society. That's where this is going to go. We saw it recently in Canada, didn't we? With Trudeau. He froze the bank accounts and the cryptocurrency accounts of anybody who gave to the truckers' convoy. Never mind the fact the truckers' convoy was a legal protest. In his opinion, the problem was not that it was legal, it was that they held unacceptable views. And therefore he unilaterally he voted through the Emergency Act in Canada, and he froze the accounts of people who were giving to an entirely legal activity. So you say this thing could never happen? Oh yeah, we just saw it 3 months ago in Canada. And Canada prides itself as being a bastion of democracy and civil rights. All around the world, Canada presents itself as being, the paragon of human rights. And we saw the hard reality just a few months ago in the truckers' convoy. And China has its own social credit system as well that's very similar to that, freezing people out of economic activity if they hold unacceptable views. And that freezing out takes place through digital means. Next slide. So in Dubai this year, just about 4 weeks ago, the World Economic Summit met over there in Dubai in the Gulf, 29th through 30th of March. My apologies for that. There were over 4,000 participants representing 190 nations, our ambassadors, national politicians, prime ministers, technocrats, and the leaders of international organizations. And they were discussing really how we're going to move towards this great reset. And so next slide. So this is one of the quotes from Dr. Malmgreen, who used to be the special advisor on economic policy to President George W. Bush. She was a speaker there, and this is what she said. She said, "What underpins a world order is always the financial system. We're on the brink of dramatic change where we're about to abandon the traditional system of money and accounting and introduce a new one. It means digital, having an almost perfect record of every single transaction that happens in the economy, which will give us far greater clarity over what's going on. It also raises huge dangers in terms of the balance of power between states and citizens." Of course it does. And they actually recognize this at this meeting that took place in Dubai just a few weeks ago, with over 4,000 people, participants present, world business leaders and politicians from around the world. So the idea that we're moving away from the traditional pound sterling and US dollar and the yuan and so forth, that's happening in front of our eyes. The fiat currencies are going to die, and the governments know this, which is why they're pushing forward with this great reset, which will involve digital money. Next slide. Now, the implications of this are that to use a central bank digital currency, you're going to need a digital identity. Otherwise, you can't access it. And if you just fly out of Chicago O'Hare, I got on a plane last week to 2 weeks ago to Romania, and they didn't want to see my boarding pass when I got on the plane. Well, I had to stand in front of this like an optician's, and they read my retina. Like, you're allowed to fly, sir. And so my biodata, my biometric data is linked to the airline systems, and is also linked to the Department of Homeland Security and no-fly lists and so forth. So I stand in front of the biometric data of the scanner, and it reads my eyes and says, yes, sir, you can get on board this plane. And so to use, this is an example of the integration of technology we're now seeing, and it's accelerating. So to use a central bank digital currency, you're going to need a digital identity. And with those digital identities, what we see in China, which is the most advanced version of these digital identities, is you're going to have to play by the social credit scene in order to gain access to it. So the goal of centrally controlled digital currencies explains why our Western leaders are not worried about the debasement of the value of the dollar and the pound and the yen, because they know that our fiat currencies are dying anyway. Let's just spend while we can, because it's going to collapse. We know it's going to collapse, and we're going to put in place the digital currencies that are going to replace it. And when we go to digital currencies, we will have absolute control over every transaction that's ever conducted. So again, these things about religious liberty, I hope you're realizing some of the implications of what we're talking about here. That the world as we know it is coming to an end in terms of economics and religious and civil liberties. So next slide. So CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, they allow ultimate control on a global basis on all transactions for every person on planet Earth by a one world government, or if we don't have a one world government, by a Western system of collective governments that collectively assign value and access to every individual. You don't need a one world government to impose Revelation 13, you just need the governments of the world to act in harmony with each other. We agree on these standards. And so access and utilization to these central bank digital currencies will be based on your social credit score, such as what you believe, who you vote for, what you post or do not post on social media, and what faith group you're a part of. Those are some of the components of the Chinese social credit system, which is what's happening. It's coming into America via cancel culture today. So next slide, please. So the loss of freedoms, so the loss of financial freedoms will inevitably lead to the elimination of civil and religious freedoms. Now, I'm not the only one saying that. There's plenty of journalists out there who are raising the alarm bells in the financial literature that's out there. Journalist after journalist is raising these concerns that we can see where this is going. There's almost nothing we can do to stop it because our current currencies are dying. But the journalists who write about these things are recognizing in financial newspapers that we are looking at not just the elimination of financial freedom, because the government doesn't know what you're spending your money on, but it's going to lead to the elimination, inevitably, of civil and religious liberty. And so the prophetic scenario of Revelation 13, with a global exclusion from buying and selling at a global level for those who stand for liberty of conscience and for true worship on the Sabbath day, according to their conscience, will now be technically feasible in just a few short years from now. So the dollars you have in your savings accounts, use them well, because there's going to come a time where what you are allowed, what the government will have much more say over what you can spend your money on, okay? And so, next slide. So in conclusion here, we have three mega trends. The first is the Great Reset, and that's involving centralization of economic power around the world, Economic, Social and Governance Index, the Esg Index, which is basically giving us woke corporations, and that tramples on religious liberties. We're looking at the fourth industrial revolution. The main feature of that for us is artificial intelligence developments, robots and nanotechnology, and humans 2.0, merging us with technology so that we actually upgrade the human species. Where you basically become, I become not this body and this mind, but ultimately I'll just become a file on a server somewhere. And then thirdly is the trend towards digital currencies. So cryptos are an attempt to escape the death of the fiat currencies, but cryptos are probably going to be regulated by the governments when they bring in their central bank digital currencies. And with the central bank digital currencies, the US government or the British government or the Japanese government will have absolute knowledge and absolute control over every transaction you ever make. And if that doesn't scare you, then nothing will. So, for instance, if you want to return a tithe, well, the government determines that because the Adventist Church speaks about the papacy in the way it does, therefore giving your tithe to the Catholic Church, returning your tithe to your local conference, that's a socially unacceptable view. You may find yourself frozen out of access to the economic system in the future. not just for doing it today, but if you gave tithe in the past, it will freeze you out today, because they'll have access to that kind of data. So a couple of challenges for us all here today. Firstly, I want to encourage you to to position your life and your finances and the way you live so that the corrupt powers of this world have as few pressure points on you as possible. Does that make sense? And you can take that suggestion and run it through your own life and how you interact with this world, but position your life so the corrupt powers of this world have as few pressure points on you as possible. If COVID didn't teach you that, I'm hoping this presentation this afternoon will inspire you to start thinking in those ways. You want as few entanglements with the world as possible, whatever business or life you have right now, so that the world has as few pressure points on you as possible when it seeks to bring pressure upon you. Secondly, we need to be preparing ourselves spiritually, financially, and emotionally, because our world is changing fast, and there are going to be some people who take advantage of the new realities, and some people who grieve the loss of the old realities. But what we've learned through history is that within any population there is an unhealthily large component of people who are quite happy to act in a totalitarian way towards their neighbors. There are far too many people willing to obey orders and do evil work and not raise a voice of protest against it. There are way too many people, as we saw in COVID, who are kind of yearning for totalitarian power over their neighbor. We've seen that in COVID, where your civil and religious liberties can evaporate overnight, your constitutional rights will disappear, and you are subject to the whim of a local mayor or governor or president. So we need to prepare ourselves spiritually and financially and emotionally. We're in for a roller coaster ride before Jesus comes again. And thirdly, because gospel work will be considered hate speech. We know that's going to happen. People already joking online about banning the Bible from Amazon because the Bible is allegedly homophobic. Therefore, why does Amazon carry the Bible? It's only a matter of time before those jesting statements become serious statements. So while you have the freedom to spend your dollars the way you have your freedom, spend your dollars to advance the kingdom of God. Because when we go to central bank digital currencies and the gospel message is declared hate speech, or the truth about the papacy in the United States is declared hate speech or socially unacceptable views, you will not be able to spend your resources on furthering the gospel work. So while your dollars have value, and while your dollars have utility, and while you have relative anonymity in what you buy, now is the time to be investing in God's kingdom, because there's going to come a time when you no longer have those abilities. Okay, that's just reality. And they saw it in the Soviet Union, they see it in communist China to some extent, when governments seek absolute control of what happens in society, and with digital currencies they will know every transaction you ever make. Then your ability to invest in gospel work, whether it's buying steps to Christ, whether it's paying rent of a hall, whether it's making a donation to Adventist World Radio, that will be severely curtailed, because the messages they bear are socially unacceptable. So for religious liberty, I'd encourage you today to put your assets to work for God today. Because there's going to come a time when those assets will not be allowed to work. You'll be able to buy beer with it, but you won't be able to share the bread of life. So put your assets to good use today. Because we can see these changes happening right in front of us. US government is actively developing the digital dollar right now. The executive order was a few months ago. The British are doing it. The Chinese have already got one. And this is going to spread around the world, and governments will do it because the fiat currencies are dying, and because digital currencies give them massive control over the population economically. So these are three mega trends that are affecting our world today. And the good news is that Jesus is still coming again, and those who survive to the end, they shall be saved, and that Jesus knows what we can each take at a personal level, and no temptation or trial will come upon you, but what God knows you can already deal with it. And so when a trial comes your way, view it as a vote of confidence by God. And God says, I know this trial is coming your way, but I've given you a way of getting out of this, and it's a vote of confidence that I know you can survive whatever the world is throwing at you. So Our world is changing fast. Our religious and civil liberties will become antiquated parts of the past, and the governments of the world will presume the right to override conscience and to override your economic decision-making. And that's exactly as we see in Revelation 13. Now, maybe for the first time in human history, we see the technological means being put in place in the next couple of years for Revelation 13's global mandates to come into effect and for the end to come. So put your money to work in gospel work, use your time for gospel work, use the talents that God has given you. If you have the gift of encouragement, you like praying with people, you like visiting the poor, you have the gift of preaching or teaching, use your spiritual gifts as much as you can from now on, because there will come a time when even that will be curtailed as well. So the last one I want to share with you this afternoon, it's 4 o'clock almost, 1 minute to 4. I said we try and be done by 4. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. It's been a pleasure sharing with you here. And yeah, we're in for troubled times, but when you know the end of the story, you can kind of grit your teeth. It's like my girl likes roller coasters. I hate roller coasters. And she will happily queue for an hour to get on a roller coaster, which I absolutely dread. The only thing that gets me on the roller coaster is seeing, when you get on the roller coaster, other people coming in next to you. They've just gone through it. Their eyes are kind of wide open like that, but they're okay. You think, okay, I've got to get through 90 seconds. I'm counting down, okay? I hate doing this kind of stuff. I have enough excitement in my life. I don't want it. But what gets me through is knowing that there is an end, and the end is in sight, and the end is near, and the end means this trouble is going to be over. And that's where we are as Christians. This kingdom, this world is not our home. We should not be, if you go forward 2 slides, please, the final slide, I've got a text there. Yeah, there it is. So, we often quote this verse in the COVID crisis, the last sentence, it says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. But the first half of the verse is interesting. The Apostle Paul saying this is what God has said, is keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so the promise that I will never leave you nor forsake you is particularly applicable to people who maybe lost their jobs under the mandates and who said, I will stand for conscience rather than bow to economic pressure. This is a beautiful promise for people who went through that kind of struggle in the last couple of years. And in the final crisis, where there will be economic exclusion of those who are faithful to God, this is a very beautiful promise. And so be content with what you have, because particularly in the economic sphere, God has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. It's a beautiful promise from God. All right, so we'll close with a word of prayer, and then we will finish. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the freedoms we enjoy here to share some of these topics. Lord, we're living in troubled times, and I thank you that even today, that some of these things are being telegraphed to us a long way out so we can see what's going to happen. I thank you, Father, for the prophetic light you've given us, which is a light in the darkness to guide us, to help us to avoid stumbling unnecessarily, to guide us through to our heavenly home. And Father, I pray that we will live in the prophetic light day by day, that our lives, our spiritual gifts, our talents, our funds, our resources, and our prayers will be devoted to one purpose and one purpose alone, to share the gospel with every nation, tribe, language, and people, and then the end shall come. So, Father, dismiss us now with your blessing. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. My voice is